What's up with Caroline Bingley? Hi Booktube, and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to deconstruct a character in Jane Austen's book Pride and Prejudice. I'm doing this for Jane Austen July. What do I mean by deconstruct a character? I was inspired to do this video by one of Katie of Books and Things videos, where she talks about how on a reread of Pride and Prejudice, she concentrated on one character to better understand their place in the story. And I thought I would do this. Well, I didn't really intend to do this, but because I read Pride and Prejudice about 40 years ago. So I had this in my mind though. So when I started rereading the book on Goodreads, one character stood out to me, and it's not one of the characters that you might be thinking. So I wanted to, when this happened, I wanted to see how they stood in relation to the rest of the book, and how I could interpret that. So more importantly, I saw her as a foil for other characters in the book, as well as a representation of Regency women at the time of that class. So who am I talking about? I'm talking about Caroline Bingley. So I'm going to talk about this in scenes. So I broke down, to make this easier to talk about, I broke this information down in scenes, which I will talk about. It's not scenes related to the book. They're scenes that I kind of made up, so they're not like exactly taken from the book. So let's get to it. By the way, there are spoilers here, so if you haven't read Pride and Prejudice, please take note of that. There are spoilers, maybe not main spoilers of the book, but there will be spoilers. Okay, so we're first introduced by Miss Caroline Bingley in narrative by other characters in the book. So in the first scene where she's mentioned, Lizzie says, "And so you like these man's sisters? Their manners are not equal to his." Jane agrees, but says they are pleasing once you converse with them. So that's interesting, because Jane, who's a very pleasing character herself, and there's hardly anything said that's negative about her in the book. She's actually a foil, and I'm going to get into that later, for Elizabeth. So, but she's agreeing that Caroline Bingley and her sister, Mrs. Hurst, are not very pleasing. Lizzie thinks they're proud and conceited, although she says they're fine ladies and handsome, which we call pretty today. Okay, so the second scene is the letter, which really demonstrates her character. And I'm going to read it because it's not very long. She says, a letter comes, and it says, "My dear friend, if you are not so compassionate as to dine today with Louisa and me, you shall be in danger of hating each other for the rest of our lives. We shall be in danger, for a whole day's tete-a-tete between two women can never end without a quarrel. Come as soon as you can on receipt of this. My brother and the gentlemen are to dine with the officers. Yours ever, Caroline Bingley." So this is the first interaction between Elizabeth and Caroline. And as I'm going to say later, letters have a lot to do with their interaction and the moving of the plot. So what does this letter say about Caroline Bingley? She seems pleasant, if a little over the top, though I'm not sure if this is over the top at that time. And insincere much? Okay, so third scene. Caroline is forced by her brother to be civil when Jane becomes ill while visiting. And this was a whole scene in which Jane had to go by horseback in the rain because the carriage wasn't available. And I kind of blame this on Mrs. Bennet, but that's not what I'm here to discuss today. So it comes to, she needs to stay another day. So Charles, who's Jane's, love interest in Pride and Prejudice, says, "Removed? My sister, I am sure we will not hear of removal," Charles says. And Caroline says coldly, "You may depend on it, madam, that Miss Bennet will receive every possible attention while she remains with us," she says coldly. So we see here that she must obey her brother. Brothers were much above, or men in general were much above women in the Regency period, and she can't disagree with him. But she really, really hates Mrs. Bennet. So this must have been very hard for her to say. But she does obey. So we see something of the personality of her. She speaks coldly, but she obeys her brother. Okay, so scene 4. Mr. Hurst looked at Elizabeth with astonishment. "Do you prefer reading to cards?" And Caroline says, "Miss Eliza Bennet despises cards. She's a great reader and has no pleasure in anything else." So Elizabeth answers, "I deserve neither such praise or such censure," cried Elizabeth. "I have great pleasure in many things." Now, let's have a little talk about reading here. In a prior scene, Miss Caroline Bingley is admiring Mr. Darcy's book collection, and she was saying that it's so much, in some banter, she's trying to, have a conversation with him, and she's saying that that her collection in her house is not half as good as Mr. Darcy's collection, and he answers something like, "Well, it has to be because, we've been collecting books for like forever." So here I have to stop and say that my good friend Janelle of Too Fond of Books on Goodreads, and may I say something that she wrote on the Goodreads chat. She said, "The contrast between the attempted banter of Miss Bingley and Darcy and the actual banter between Elizabeth and Darcy is really interesting in chapter 10. So, we go on to some more banter. And Miss Bingley saw or suspected enough to be jealous of her great anxiety for the recovery of her dear friend Jane. And she received some assistance from her desire of getting rid of Elizabeth. So she knows that she wants to get rid of, she wants Jane to get better so she can get rid of Elizabeth because, she's not stupid. So that's something else we see. But what she does is she often tried to provoke Darcy into disliking her guest at the same time. Wrong approach. She always mentions her eyes and her inferior relations because Mr. Darcy said she had fine eyes, and this is really the wrong thing for her to do. So in deconstructing her character, we're seeing that she's not as smart. She's more angry than she is smart because she's trying to get Mr. Darcy by provoking him to dislike somebody he likes. And it shows her in a bad light while showing Elizabeth in a good light. So she goes on to say, "Elizabeth Bennet is one of those young ladies who seek to recommend themselves to the other sex by undervaluing their own. And with many men, I dare say it succeeds. But in my opinion, it is a paltry device, a very mean art." And let me just stop here and say meanness doesn't mean spite. it means it's an unworthy art or a small art. And Darcy replies, undoubtedly, there is a meanness in all the arts which ladies sometimes condescend to employ for captivation. Whatever bears infinity to cunning is despicable. So what does this mean? So he's trying to say to her that he's exposing her insincerity. But she keeps on doing it. She's not getting it. He's saying that, she's saying that Miss Bingley is saying that Elizabeth is trying to undervaluing females in order to put herself above them. And it's small and unworthy, but he's saying that all ladies condescend to captivate men. And he's trying to say that she's cunning, which is not a very nice thing, but still she doesn't get it. Okay, in another scene, Miss Bingley, or this is part of really the same scene. Miss Bingley, you know, after talking about how his book collection is so grand and wonderful, she picks up a book, one of the books that he happens to be reading, like a sequel to it, and you know she's not interested in the book. She just wants to captivate him, but it's not working. He still keeps on reading. So Miss Bingley got up and walked around the room. Her figure was elegant and she walked well, but Darcy, at whom it was aimed, was still inflexibly studious. In the desperation of her feelings, she resolved on one effort more, and turning to Elizabeth said, Miss Eliza Bennet, let me persuade you to follow my example and take a turn around the room. I assure you it's very refreshing after sitting so long in one attitude. Elizabeth was surprised, but agreed to it immediately. Miss Bingley succeeded no less in the real object of her civility. Mr. Darcy looked up. So here we're already seeing that he didn't look up when Miss Caroline Bingley started walking around the room, no matter how beautiful she was or how well her figure was. But the minute that Elizabeth got up, he starts paying attention. In another scene around this time, Caroline and Mr. Darcy are speaking. And she doesn't notice that in this scene, Mr. Darcy is actually insulting her. So she said, I can guess the subject of your reverie. He said, I should imagine not. He knows her and answers with intrepidity, fearlessness. And I think it's pronounced intrepidity. If you know how to pronounce it, let me know. Okay. I have been meditating on the very great pleasure which a pair of fine eyes in the face of a pretty woman can bestow. And he's talking about Caroline. And this is where it starts with the fine eyes, and Caroline keeps on referring to it, which was a bad mistake. So she comes back with a sharp retort about what a fine mother-in-law he would have. And at that moment she feels safe. But where is this woman's intuition? Okay, scene 5. He knows what Caroline is up to. So he was directly invited to join their party, but he declined it. And this is when Caroline gets up and walks around the room with Elizabeth. So this happens before the scene that I was talking about. But he said that he can imagine but two motives for their choosing to walk up and down the room together, with either of which motives his joining them would interfere. So Miss Bingley, and this tells her character too, was incapable of disappointing Mr. Darcy in anything, and persevered therefore in requiring an explanation of his two motives. So Elizabeth said, let's not ask him, because that'll just, make him feel good about himself. Not in those words, of course. But Miss Bingley, she was incapable of disappointing Mr. Darcy. And that's where she went wrong, because he wanted to be disappointed in the sense that he didn't want to be agreed with all the time. So he answers, "You either choose this method of passing the evening because you are in each other's confidence," which he knows they're not, "and have secret affairs to discuss, or because you are conscious that your figures appear to the greatest advantage in walking. In the first, I would be completely in your way if they had a confidence. And in the second, I can admire you so much better as I sit by the fire." So I was reading in another analysis of Pride and Prejudice that this is as sexy as this scene is going to get, because he's talking about how well they look while walking, their figures. And that's as daring as a gentleman would get at that time. And then they start having, Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy start having, one of their charming banters. And after the repartee, Caroline cries, "Do let it she wasn't really happy that they were, going back and forth, and she wasn't involved. So she says, "Do let us have a little music." And in that, she leaves them alone, thinking that, she's going to sing or dance or, or play a lively, she would get attention. But it worked the opposite for her, because Mr. Darcy gets to really have a conversation with Elizabeth. Okay. In another scene, in my 104, I'm talking about how Caroline Bingley is not only a foil for all these things, but all these people, but she also plays a part in making the plot advance by telling Caroline in a later part of the book how Mr. Wickham is actually not a good person as she thinks he is, and is actually, she blames it on his breeding though, and that really, takes away from her motivations. But she knows the truth about Mr. Wickham because she's in the family. She knows what's happening. So, but Elizabeth doesn't believe her. So in this way, she's advancing the plot. And then page 130, another letter from Caroline that I'm not going to read. But in this letter, Caroline is writing a letter to Jane to kind of tell her in a very bad way that Mr. Darcy, Mr. Bingham is not interested in her, that he's actually interested in someone else, and that's Mr. Darcy's sister, which is really untrue. So Jane, who's a foil for Elizabeth, says to Elizabeth, "Is it not clear enough? Does it not expressly declare that Caroline neither expects nor wishes me to be her sister, that she is perfectly convinced of her brother's indifference, and that if she suspects the nature of my feelings for him, she means most kindly to put me on my guard? Can there be any other opinion on this subject?" So then she says, Elizabeth says, "Do you want my opinion?" And then Miss Bingley's, Elizabeth says to her sister, "You shall have it in a few words. Miss Bingley sees that her brother is in love with you and wants him to marry Miss Darcy. She follows him in town in hopes of keeping him there and tries to persuade you that he does not care about you. Elizabeth is wrong here in giving Miss Bingley too much power." So that's another thing. So Elizabeth is wrong in two ways. She doesn't believe Caroline Bingley about Wickham, and here she's giving Caroline too much power, and women didn't have that much power in convincing. I mean, not that she's not trying to convince, but it's actually, and this is a spoiler, Mr. Darcy is the one keeping them apart. So she says, "Indeed, Jane, you ought to believe me. No one who has ever seen you together," and that's Mr. Bingley and Jane, "can no doubt his affection. Miss Bingley, I'm sure, cannot. She is not such a simpleton. Could she not have seen half as much love in Mr. Darcy for herself, she would have ordered her wedding clothes." And that made me really laugh. But the case is this. We are not rich enough or grand enough for them, and she is the more anxious to get Mr. Darcy for her brother. So even though Elizabeth is very smart in a lot of ways in her astuteness about people, she's not always correct. And in this way, she's both proud and is prejudiced. And Jane replies, "If we thought alike of Miss Bingley, your representation of all this might make me quite easy. But I know the foundation is unjust. Caroline is incapable of willfully deceiving anyone, and all that I can hope is, in this case, is that she is deceiving herself." So again, like I said, Jane is the foil for Elizabeth. She's always thinking the best of people, and in a way, Elizabeth sees the worst in a lot of people, let's put it that way. So, summary of what I've been saying is that Caroline Bingley is an integral part of Pride and Prejudice. She not only advances the plot, but she serves as a foil for the budding relationship of Elizabeth and Darcy. So what is a foil character? A foil character in literature, although is in actions or words, in their actions and words, highlights and directly contrasts the personal traits, qualities, values, and motivations of another character. And I found this interesting, that the term comes from the old jeweler's practice. When I mean old, I mean like Old England jeweler practice of displaying gemstones on sheets of foil to make them shine more brightly. Similarly, in literature, a foil character illuminates another character. So Caroline is illuminating Elizabeth. She's showing how much better a person Elizabeth is as well, but she's so much more than that. So in literature, why do they use foil characters? And I'm saying also that there are more foil characters. Jane is also a foil character of Elizabeth, because she, her sweetness and acceptance of all of everyone makes Elizabeth seem like brighter, smarter maybe, more inclined not to believe people. So a foil character also has to do with the motivations of the other characters, and it helps the reader to see what they're going to do. And I think that Caroline Bingley is more than a foil character, like I said, and is necessary to bring Jane to Bingley's house in the beginning, as well as Elizabeth to Bingley's house. And like I said, she forwards the plot by telling the truth about Bingley, about Wickham. So let's get to the final scene. So convinced as Elizabeth now was that Miss Bingley's dislike of her had originated in jealousy, she could not help feeling how welcome her appearance will be at Pemberley, and was curious to know how much civility on that lady's side the acquaintance would now be renewed. So Elizabeth soon saw that she was herself being watched by Miss Bingley, and that she could not speak a word, especially to Miss Darcy, without calling her attention. And this scene comes when toward the end of the book, when first Miss Elizabeth Bennet is brought to Pemberley for the first time. So here, this is Caroline's final conversation with Mr. Darcy. "For my own part," she rejoined, "I must confess that I never could see any beauty in her. Her face is too thin, her complexion has no brilliancy, and her features are not all handsome. Her nose wants character, there is nothing marked in its lines, her teeth are tolerable, but not out of any common way. And as for her eyes, which have sometimes been called so fine, I could never see anything extraordinary in them. They have a sharp, shrewish look, which I do not like at all, and in her air altogether there is a self-sufficiency without fashion, which is intolerable." So persuaded as Miss Bingley was that Darcy admired Elizabeth, this was not the best method of recommending herself. But angry people are not always wise. And this was written as a narration from Jane Austen herself. So, what is she saying here? She's her own worst enemy, is what she's saying. And she's saying it that angry people are not always wise. So we go on, and in seeing him at last look somewhat nettled, she had all the success she expected. He was resolutely silent, however, and from a determination of making him speak, she continued. So she's at a point of desperation right now. "I remember when we first knew her at Hertfordshire, how amazed we all are to find that she was a reported beauty. And I particularly recollect you saying one night after they had dined at Netherfield, 'She a beauty? I should as soon called her mother a wit.' But afterwards she seemed to improve on you, and I believe you thought her rather pretty at one time." "Yes," replied Darcy, who can contain himself no longer. "But that was when I first saw her, for it is many months since I have considered her as one of the handsomest women of my acquaintance." He then went away, and Miss Bingley was left to all the satisfaction of having forced him to say what gave no one any pain but herself. So we go back to angry people are not always wise. And she pushed him to the point that he was hurting her. And she hurt herself by forcing him to do that. And that's why Jane Austen says, angry people are not always wise. So what did I learn from this deconstruction? And I think I said it already. So Caroline is both a foil for Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth, and her presence was necessary for many of the interactions between Elizabeth and her, and in fact the comparison between the two are part of what makes Darcy fall in love with Elizabeth. And also she moves the plot along with her letters and conversations, etc. Now, I just wanted to say at the end that women at the time had little power and how to use their looks and what was expected of them, like being good at the pianoforte, which I looked up and is actually just a piano, and what was called pianoforte because I think it was invented in Italy. And also women had pressure to marry well, especially women of the class of Miss Bingley, not even more than maybe of Elizabeth. Caroline wanted to live in Pemberley. We know that. She admires Mr. Darcy a lot for how he looks and for what he has. And Mr. Darcy is very aware that he's sought after by many women, many mothers and women because of that. And he's I think that's what makes Mr. Darcy very, careful. And I think, but I'm not here to talk about Mr. Darcy, but I'm here to talk about Caroline. So he wanted, but I'm going back to Mr. Darcy for a minute, but he wanted honesty and wit and intellect. and she wasn't astute enough, Caroline wasn't, to see that he didn't want to be admired. So her anger made her a foil to Elizabeth, as well as making her more interesting to Mr. Darcy. Anyway, so that's what I wanted to talk about in my deconstruction of Caroline Bingley and why I think she's such an important character. I'm going to watch the movie, the mini-series of Pride and Prejudice soon, and I want to see how that is brought about in the movie. What did you think? If you've read Pride and Prejudice, what did you think of Miss Bingley? Do you think she was an important part of the book as much as I did? And what did you think of Jane Austen saying that angry people aren't always wise? And how does this reflect on Jane Austen? I wanted to talk more about in another video about what women of the Regency period were expected to be, how they were expected to behave, and how it's different for our modern women, and how modern women have a lot more power, not enough power, but their lives are much different from that of Elizabeth Bennet et al. So please, if you like this video, please subscribe to my channel and like and press the notification bell. I'm really enjoying Jane Austen July, and I'm going to have more videos about other books I'm reading and about the life and times of Jane Austen. So until we meet again, my friends, aloha.